But what was actually happening on the ground told a very different story. The American Quartermaster Corps had developed sophisticated mobile kitchen units, steel-constructed trailers equipped with insulated cooking vessels, efficient burners, and organized storage systems. These could be pulled by jeeps or transport trucks, assembled in less than 10 minutes, and serve several hundred soldiers from a single position. During that autumn, as American forces pushed through forests and across muddy terrain toward German territory, these kitchen units followed closely behind. German defenders dug into their positions began noticing something peculiar drifting on the wind. The unmistakable aroma of actual food, coffee, beans, even cooked meat, while artillery shells still screamed overhead. Initially, they dismissed it as some sort of psychological trick or assumed they were imagining things. But alongside the mockery, genuine curiosity started to take root. They would soon experience firsthand the very system they had been taught to ridicule. 2 days later, heavy rain turned the trenches into rivers of mud. Everything smelled of wet wool, explosives, and damp earth. The forest became nearly impossible to see through. On the American side of no man's land, there was unusual activity that confused the German observers. Canvas screens were being erected, small trailers were being positioned behind jeeps. At first glance, the Germans assumed this was communications equipment or ammunition being moved into place. Then the wind changed direction, carrying an unexpected scent: freshly brewed coffee and simmering meat. German soldiers in their dugout exchanged confused looks. Someone said they were actually cooking, right there, practically on the front line. Through field glasses, a sergeant verified what seemed unbelievable. The Americans had indeed set up their mobile kitchens, establishing them just behind their forward positions even as distant explosions continued. One young private suggested it had to be some elaborate morale operation. Another soldier made a dark prediction that they would capture all that food once the Americans inevitably retreated. But there was no retreat. American troops formed orderly lines with their mess trays, helmets angled against the falling rain, steam rising as hot food was spooned into their plates and cups. From across the lines, it looked completely surreal to the watching Germans. Soldiers who should have been crouched in defensive positions were calmly consuming hot stew and beans under camouflage tarps. What disturbed the Germans even more was that American operations continued without any apparent disruption. Patrols still went out on schedule. Artillery continued firing. Radio communications maintained their constant chatter. They were simultaneously fighting and eating. A German corporal muttered that in his experience, Wehrmacht units regularly went an entire day or two without any hot meals during active operations. Here, the Americans seemed to treat it as routine procedure. This sight contradicted years of military indoctrination. If their enemies were truly weak and soft, how were they continuing to advance through difficult terrain while maintaining hot meal service? That night in the dugout, whispers circulated. Half the men couldn't quite believe it, the other half couldn't hide their envy. Someone spoke quietly about how good even a single bowl of warm soup would be. For the first time, the ridiculous American field kitchens started to seem less like a joke and more like a genuine question mark. That question would be answered more directly than the Germans anticipated. The fighting through that autumn was brutal and continuous. German units were spread dangerously thin across the forest, running low on ammunition and going increasingly hungry. During one confused nighttime firefight near a strategic crossroads, an entire German squad found itself isolated and cut off. By morning they were completely surrounded and had no choice but to surrender. Raising their hands, they trudged through the mud toward American lines, bracing for rough treatment, shouting, physical abuse, perhaps worse. Instead, they encountered businesslike efficiency. An American sergeant searched them for weapons, marked their uniforms with tags, and directed them toward a cluster of tents set up behind the forward area. The Germans initially assumed they were being taken for interrogation. Then they smelled it. coffee, onions, and something richer and more substantial. To their complete astonishment, a mobile kitchen sat under camouflage netting, with steam rising from its kettles. Soldiers wearing aprons rather than carrying weapons were ladling food into mess trays. The prisoners were formed into a line right alongside American soldiers who had just finished a patrol shift. There was no separation, no shouting guards, just trays and rising steam. A cook made a gesture toward one of the German prisoners, holding up a ladle filled with beef stew. The man hesitated, looking at his captors uncertainly. The cook simply shrugged and poured it into his tray anyway. The stew was thick and hot, filled with chunks of potato and carrot. The prisoner's hands shook as he accepted the tray. He had consumed nothing but hard bread and canned meat for days. When he finally tasted the stew, his eyes went wide. This wasn't merely food, it was warmth, salt, fat, the fundamental elements that built physical strength. The other prisoners around him stared down at their trays as though they had been given something precious. Some muttered in disbelief, others simply ate in silence, their faces flushing with the heat. An American guard placed a metal container of coffee nearby. One German sniffed it suspiciously before taking a sip. The bitterness surprised him, but the warmth spread through his body like a physical wave. In that moment, all those years of jokes about soft American soldiers simply collapsed. Under fire, in the middle of mud and combat, these men still managed to provide hot meals, and now their captives were receiving the same treatment. For the prisoners, the field kitchen had transformed from myth into reality. It became their first real glimpse of a military system built on abundance and planning, rather than just endurance and sacrifice. That first meal as prisoners of war represented a turning point. The Germans, still damp and cold from the forest, sat beneath a tent specifically designed for mobile feeding operations, struggling to comprehend how such a thing could even exist on an active battlefield. They had always imagined supply lines as fragile things, easily disrupted or cut. Yet here, the Americans moved food forward with the same priority and precision as ammunition. A captured German sergeant, who had previously been responsible for rations in his own unit, stared at the steam kettles in bewilderment. "How?" he kept muttering. "How is this even possible here?" Through an interpreter, he learned that every American infantry regiment included its own dedicated field kitchen platoon. Truck convoys delivered provisions on rigid schedules. Mobile kitchens heated food in specially insulated containers that kept it warm for extended periods. This was not improvised luck, but a refined system that had been developed and perfected since 1942. The German prisoners listened in stunned silence. In their own army, cooks remained far behind the combat zones, and meals arrived cold if they arrived at all. One prisoner whispered to his companion about a time during the Russian winter when his unit had melted snow to make something resembling soup. Yet here, the enemy provided real meat to even their prisoners. Outside, supply trucks continued arriving with more provisions. Flour sacks, crates of preserved foods, barrels of coffee. The entire process operated with mechanical precision. The Americans clearly treated their kitchens as essential equipment on the same level as artillery pieces or radio gear. They rotated cooks forward under armed escort, ensuring the kitchens remained mobile and protected. The Germans began grasping the deeper significance. Hot food wasn't a sign of softness. It represented logistics, careful planning, and morale management. An older prisoner said quietly that the Americans didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with food. The others nodded slowly as they continued eating their stew. Even the small details impressed them. Trays with divided compartments, cups designed to clip onto belts, food preserved in vacuum-sealed containers. For soldiers raised in an environment of scarcity, these weren't luxuries, but evidence of an industrial machine capable of feeding entire armies the way one might feed a city. In that realization came the first crack in their belief in German superiority. a recognition that the enemy's real power came not just from superior weapons, but from their ability to nourish their troops even under combat conditions. By the second week of their captivity, the German prisoners had stopped staring at the field kitchens with disbelief. They began lining up calmly with their trays, as though they had always eaten this way. Morning coffee became their first daily ritual. Steam would rise from metal cups while frost still clung to the ground around them. For men accustomed to substitute brews, real coffee was almost intoxicating. The Americans maintained strict meal schedules, breakfast, lunch, and dinner at designated times. This felt strange to soldiers trained to eat whenever and whatever happened to be available. Prisoners were given simple duties around the kitchen: peeling potatoes, stacking clean trays, washing kettles. Initially, they resisted. Then they realized the work came with extra servings of stew and occasionally an additional slice of bread. Through this work, they observed the system from the inside. Everything was labelled, weighed, and timed. Fuel was measured precisely. Recipes were scaled mathematically to feed hundreds. A corporal who had once mocked American softness found himself admiring the pure efficiency of it all. He whispered to another prisoner that the Americans treated food the same way they treated ammunition. Even the guards took turns in the kitchen, learning basic cooking skills. No one was exempt from understanding the supply system. Everyone ate together. Some prisoners began regaining weight, their faces filling out after months of lean rations. Others felt their physical strength returning, their hands no longer trembling with hunger. The kitchen became a source of quiet fascination. Between ladling soup and washing pans, they asked questions about the unusual stoves, the insulated food containers, the spices they had never encountered before. One American cook, speaking slowly in English, joked that hot food was actually a secret weapon in the US military arsenal. The prisoners laughed, but part of them suspected there was truth in that statement. In the barracks after dark, the men compared notes and observations. Some talked about building similar systems in Germany after the war ended. Others simply marvelled at the concept of warm meals as a basic right rather than a rare privilege. The change was more than just physical, it was psychological. Food had always been a symbol of scarcity and endurance. Now it was becoming a symbol of abundance, organisation, and even respect. The prisoners were beginning to understand that their captors' strength didn't come solely from superior numbers or better weapons, but from a fundamental mindset where logistics served as the lifeblood of military operations. By adapting to this mindset, they started seeing the war and their own place in it through completely different eyes. Winter settled heavily around the prisoner camp. Snow covered the barbed wire fences, and the sky remained a constant pale grey. Yet inside the camp, the kettles continued steaming and meals kept arriving on schedule. German prisoners who had arrived gaunt and suspicious now stood with better posture during roll call. Their uniforms still showed the wear of combat, but their bodies were recovering their health. Food had become a bridge for understanding. Initially, it had been purely about survival. Now it fostered conversation, curiosity, and the gradual dissolution of old belief systems. Some prisoners started asking about cooking techniques, how to roast meat without losing its flavour, how to properly brew coffee. American cooks, half amused by the interest, answered in broken German or through gestures and demonstrations. The kitchen, once a symbol worthy of mockery, had become neutral territory where captors and captives could interact as human beings rather than as enemies. A young German corporal who had survived the brutal Russian front admitted quietly that he had never felt this physically strong even during what was considered the height of German military success. He blamed the cold rations from those days and now credited the Americans' commitment to hot meals. The Americans noticed the transformation too. Guards who had initially watched the prisoners with deep suspicion now greeted them at mealtimes with casual nods or occasional jokes. This didn't erase the fact of war, but it created an unusual pocket of normalcy within it, a space where hot food blunted natural hostility. Letters written home reflected these changes. Prisoners wrote about the field kitchens almost as much as they wrote about their families. "We receive hot stew twice daily," one wrote. "It surpasses anything our own army ever provided us." For the German officers among the prisoners, the revelation was particularly tactical. They began understanding that the American war machine wasn't simply about overwhelming force, but represented an integrated system where logistics, supply, morale, and combat capability all interconnected. Some whispered that this might be the true explanation for Allied success. Tanks and aircraft were visible and obvious, but kitchens and supply convoys were invisible weapons that nobody had properly accounted for. The camp itself had become something like a classroom. Each ladle of soup represented a lesson in how an industrial society waged total war. For many prisoners, the lesson was difficult to absorb. They had been trained to view softness with contempt. But now they were learning that comfort could be a form of power, that taking care of soldiers was strategic, not weak. This realization marked the fundamental turning point, from mockery to respect, from envy to genuine understanding. By spring of 1945, the war was clearly approaching its conclusion. The once defiant German prisoners now watched Allied convoys rolling past the camp, their trailers still equipped with field kitchens, still feeding troops on the move. Inside the camp, the daily rhythm persisted. Hot food at dawn, warm stew at dusk. The prisoners could measure their captivity not through punishments or deprivations, but through consistent mealtimes. What had started as complete disbelief had become ordinary routine. The smell of coffee no longer surprised them. The clatter of mess trays no longer felt foreign. For many, this consistency had planted a seed of understanding. If an army could treat even its prisoners with this level of systematic care, what must it provide for its own soldiers? What might Germany have accomplished if it had adopted similar principles? Some men quietly resolved to implement these ideas after the war ended. Better kitchens, better logistics, more fundamental respect for troops. They discussed it like rebuilding infrastructure that nobody had realized was broken. American guards, meanwhile, observed the changes in the prisoners' expressions and attitudes. The hard stares of defiance had softened considerably. Questions shifted from why to how. During evenings after work assignments, prisoners would gather near the fence line and watch American supply convoys arrive. Trucks would unload provisions with the same meticulous precision that had shocked them months earlier. They realized this wasn't simply the result of American abundance, but represented deliberate doctrine. Morale as military strategy, food as fuel, hot meals as a weapon against despair and demoralization. In their letters home, some prisoners wrote almost nostalgically about the field kitchens, describing the kettles, the coffee, the bread, as though documenting an entirely different civilization. For others, the memory of that very first hot meal would remain sharper and more vivid than any battle they had experienced, serving as proof that their previous understanding of the enemy had been fundamentally wrong. Years afterward, when military historians conducted interviews with former prisoners, many specifically pointed to the American field kitchens as one of the most profound shocks of their captivity. Not the fences, not the armed guards, but the food itself. In the end, the field kitchen had accomplished something that no propaganda could achieve. It had changed minds and perspectives. It had demonstrated that strength could wear an apron, that power could manifest in serving soup under artillery fire. As the war concluded and the prisoners prepared for repatriation and return home, they understood they would leave with more than just their freedom. They would carry an enduring lesson about an army that fed its troops as aggressively as it fought its battles. In that lesson lay the lasting impression that hot meals served under fire conditions were not indicators of weakness, but represented a quiet, relentless form of power that had helped win the war.